Namaste, my dear brothers and sisters. The love and blessings of the Mother and Sri Aurobindo to all of you from Sri Aurobindo Ashram, Delhi branch. This is a topic which should be, as Arunima said, of great interest to all of us, whether or not we take tea. Probably most of us do. And at the same time, occasionally feel a little guilty if we have too much of it. And therefore, this is something which intimately concerns each one of us. With that little introduction, let me go to the PowerPoint. So the topic is tea and coffee do not give energy, they lend energy. Whether the loan is free of any interest or tea and coffee do charge some interest, simple or compound, that's something probably you will be able to make up your mind about by the time we reach the end of the session. It's going to be a serious session, and therefore let's start with at least on a lighter note. This is a quote attributed to Abraham Lincoln. If this is coffee, please bring me some tea. But if this is tea, please bring me some coffee. Probably that was his way of saying that he wanted to have neither. Probably he didn't take tea and coffee. And this was his way of getting out of it in a social situation when he was offered either tea or coffee. The active chemical, or as sometimes scientists call it, the active principle in tea and coffee is caffeine. Caffeine is also the active ingredient in cola drinks and chocolate. Caffeine is a stimulant of the central nervous system, and with that broad sort of idea, let's see what all it does. But before we go to that, although it's a stimulant of the central nervous system and therefore it can be considered a psychoactive drug, it is the world's most widely consumed psychoactive drug and is legal. Sporadic efforts have been made to ban it off and on, here and there, but they all failed. The effects of caffeine are, firstly, that it improves physical and mental performance if impaired by boredom, fatigue, exhaustion, or lack of sleep. It does improve physical and mental performance, but under what conditions? That's what's important. And it's only when it has been impaired by one of these things. But then who amongst us does not experience pretty frequently at least one of these: boredom, fatigue, exhaustion, or lack of sleep? And that does impair our performance. And therefore, most of us benefit from caffeine containing drinks like tea and coffee and turn to them in this type of a situation. But having said that, let's see if whether there's any difference between the way caffeine improves physical performance and mental performance. Physical performance is improved even if not impaired, which means that even if the person is having optimal physical performance, it can be further improved even if it has not been impaired by fatigue or exhaustion or lack of sleep. But the dose required for improvement in physical performance under that type of a situation, when the performance is already quite optimal, would be very high, much higher than we normally consume. However, this fact we can keep at the back of our mind because it will become relevant as we go along. On the other hand, mental performance is not improved if it is not already impaired, which means if it is optimal, we have none of these things: boredom, fatigue, exhaustion, or lack of sleep, mental performance has not been impaired by any of these, then it cannot be further improved upon by tea or coffee. On the other hand, especially when taken in excess, it might make a person anxious, agitated, jittery, or irritable. And that would in fact impair mental performance and perhaps also physical performance. And therefore, performance is not improved if it is impaired due to anxiety or anger. Because already caffeine has a tendency to make a person more anxious, more angry, more agitated, or irritable. If the person's hands are already unsteady, then they become more unsteady under the effects of caffeine. Caffeine also interferes with sleep and stimulates acid secretion in the stomach. These are two of the commonest side effects. And those who have these, the individuals vary. with respect to how vulnerable they are to the disruption of sleep by caffeine and acidity in the stomach because of caffeine. Individuals vary a lot, and those who are very sensitive and get at least one of these things, they generally avoid tea and coffee, and they have a good excuse for it. Those who don't experience these, they also sometimes use these as an excuse for not having tea or coffee. Uh, Instead of appearing rude in a social setting where they're offered tea, they might say it's a little too late. If I take tea now, I'll not be able to sleep too late in the evening. Or they might say, it doesn't suit my tummy. Therefore I don't take tea. So, they can use it as an excuse because these two side effects are quite widely known and do affect some individuals quite seriously, even in a normal quantity of tea or coffee. Further, especially in a higher dose, uh, caffeine increases the heart rate and might increase not only the heart rate, but also the force of contraction of the heart. The heart might start beating not only faster, but also more forcefully. And that's what gives rise to palpitation. That is a conscious feeling of the heart beating forcefully. One can feel, that in the chest. And that can make the person further anxious and jittery. So it's a two-way relationship. If due to any reason the heart rate has become fast and more forceful, the person feels anxious or jittery. On the other hand, if he's anxious or jittery, his heart tends to beat faster and more forcefully. So this relationship is a two-way relationship, as is usually the case in mind-body relationship. It might also induce irregularity of the heartbeat, or if the person already has some irregularity, which are called arrhythmias, then it can become worse under the effect of caffeine. It might also induce constriction of the coronary arteries. And this can be serious if there's already a partial block. And if there's a superimposed constriction on a partial block due to fatty deposits in the arteries, if superimposed on that is a constriction, that is a narrowing of the coronary arteries, that can block the blood flow through the heart seriously and might precipitate even a heart attack. Caffeine also might increase urinary output. All these are might, because they don't happen all the time. They don't happen usually with normal doses, and they may not happen to everybody. And therefore, these are some of the possibilities. And at least urinary output, increase in the urinary output, many of us have experienced that it is far more than can be just because of the water content of the tea or coffee. These are the acute effects, that is soon after taking tea or coffee, and the effects are attributable to caffeine. What are the long-term effects? The long-term effects are that the person becomes dependent on the quantity that is consumed. Sorry, the long-term effects depend upon the quantity consumed, which means that the higher the quantity consumed, the greater the long-term effects. Dependence will come to later on. The person becomes dependent, that will come to a little later. The long-term effects that we observe depend upon the quantity of caffeine consumed, and they vary a lot with individuals. Some individuals are more sensitive and some less. By the way, those who practice yoga seriously are generally more sensitive to the short-term as well as long-term effects of caffeine. At least the short-term effects, they are more sensitive to. Among the long-term effects, linkage with lifestyle diseases like heart disease, breast cancer, and abortions is weak and controversial, which means that there is no serious increase in the risk of these diseases because of caffeine intake, at least in the quantities normally consumed. And the fact is that most people consuming moderate quantities of caffeine seem to get away with it without any serious effects. And that's the reason why it is so common, popular, and we don't think twice before sometimes taking a cup of tea or offering somebody a cup of tea, and it is legal. Now, coming to the behavioral effects of caffeine, not only there is an improvement in the physical and mental performance, if it has been impaired by fatigue or exhaustion or lack of sleep, there's also a temporary alertness and elevation of mood. Now, let's see on this temporary part, and that is what the title was based on. I suppose our normal energy levels are somewhere here, But because of fatigue or exhaustion or lack of sleep, the energy levels have come down to this level. Now, at this point, a person takes a cup of tea or coffee. Now, the caffeine in that cup of tea or coffee improves the performance, improves the energy levels. The person feels better, the person can work better, and this stays for some time. But then it starts coming down, and it goes down to a level in below the level at which he started, the level that inspired him to take tea or coffee. It goes even below that. So this is the lending part, lends us some energy for some time, and then starts taking it back, taking the energy level to a level even lower than what we started with. Now, what is the solution to this temporary alertness and elevation of mood? The solution is take one more cup of tea or coffee to raise the energy levels again. What is the result of taking more and more tea or coffee like that? By the evening, even caffeine doesn't work. Secondly, leads to dependence. The person can't do without it. Thirdly, the person becomes tolerant to it, which means person now needs a larger quantity to get the same effect. Person becomes dependent. But why didn't I use the word addiction? The person gets addicted. Because there's a shade of a difference between addiction and dependence. Dependence is a milder form of addiction. It's more psychological. If the substance is denied to the person, he does not get into serious physical trouble, at least not life threatening trouble, which can happen in some addictions. In both addiction and dependence, the person is miserable without the substance which he has got to which he has got habituated. But dependence is milder than addiction. In case of some substances such as alcohol, dependence might progress to addiction. The person initially becomes only dependent, but then gradually he gets addicted to it. But in case of caffeine, it is just dependence, usually not addiction. However, there is an overlap between dependence and addiction, and the terms are often used interchangeably. And therefore, the current scientific term for both is substance use disorder. In scientific literature, usually now we avoid both these terms, dependence and addiction, and instead just call both of them together substance use disorder and describe what actually has happened to the person. Now, what are the effects of caffeine withdrawal? The person is dependent and the person is denied. Then, one of the commonest symptoms is headache. The person may feel more tired than usual, and that's what might uh, inspire him to take a cup of tea and coffee and break his resolve, give it up. Suppose a person has decided to give up tea and coffee. He has been taking them regularly, taking tea or coffee regularly every day for a long time. So the person has become dependent, but then he decides to give it up. And the result is he gets a headache, he feels more tired than usual, he may have some mental confusion, he may even go into a depression, and in general, feel that the energy levels are low. But then, if the person persists and uses his willpower to do without tea or coffee, he doesn't have to wait too long. Just after 3 or 4 days, he finds that a very pleasant calmness descends on him. He becomes peaceful. He no longer misses the morning cup of tea, and the energy level stays steady throughout the day. He doesn't experience those fluctuations, energy levels going up after tea and then coming down, dipping to very low levels after the effect of caffeine has worn off. So now the energy levels are steady, and the mood swings, feeling happy, feeling euphoric because the energy levels have gone up, and then feeling depressed, or if he takes too much of it, feeling agitated and angry and jittery and so on. None of those things happen. Now he does not have that type of mood swings. So, in fact, on the whole, the person feels much better after 3 or 4 days. Now, let's have a look at the caffeine content of some of the common drinks and foods in which caffeine is consumed. 1 cup of coffee, on an average, provides about 100 milligrams of caffeine. 1 cup of tea, on the other hand, provides about 50 milligrams. Now, this is in spite of the fact that, in fact, tea has a higher caffeine content than coffee. This happens because the usual practice is to put in each cup 1 or 2 teaspoons of coffee, which is a large quantity. On the other hand, you hardly may put 1 spoon of tea leaves when you are making tea for the whole family of 3 or 4 people. Or even in a tea bag, you find that the quantity of tea leaves is very small. So it's because we use smaller quantities of tea that an average cup of tea has only 50 milligrams, which means instead of having a spoon or 2 spoons of coffee, you add only a pinch of coffee and make your coffee, then it might have less caffeine than a cup of tea. So it's relative. Secondly, different types of coffee, the way they have been processed, coffee from different sources, and that applies also to tea. Uh, what type of tea, from which source, there will be a lot of variation in the caffeine content. So these are extreme, very rough figures which apply to the so-called average or typical cup of tea and coffee, although there's hardly anything like an average or typical. Our concept of what is an average or typical cup of tea or coffee would also vary a lot, just as much as tea and coffee do. But then this gives us a rough idea that the way normally tea and coffee are consumed, coffee has a much higher caffeine content, usually about double as compared to a cup of tea. Now, you might be surprised to see that green tea also has quite a bit of caffeine. It has uh, about 30 milligrams. Once again, it depends upon which green tea and so on. But all the same, green tea can have a considerable amount of caffeine. Why we feel it has very little caffeine is because psychologically, we have an association between the darkness of the color and the amount of caffeine. The two have nothing to do with each other. So you might have seen also that some varieties of tea which are pretty light can have quite a bit of caffeine. On the other hand, some which make the tea very dark, give us a very dark tea, may not have that much caffeine. So it's not the darkness of the color which is important. And although green tea is the lightest in color, perhaps compared to all the other teas, it still has a considerable amount of caffeine. One Coke or Pepsi, cola drinks, they also provide about 30 milligrams of caffeine. 35 grams of dark chocolate, which would be one bar of chocolate, a usual bar. It provides about 15 milligrams. Milk chocolate has much less caffeine, just 5 milligrams. And if we prepare chocolate milk, the usual quantity of chocolate powder we add to milk, that also has about 5 milligrams of caffeine. So this gives us some idea of the caffeine content of different drinks and foods in which caffeine is present. So one has to sort of just figure out what one wants to have, tea or coffee. And if all our problems in life were so simple, how nice it would be. And that's why the person loves days when the only problem he has is tea or coffee. That choice is not so difficult. Now let's see how much caffeine is safe. The safe quantity is about 100 milligrams a day, which means 1 cup of coffee or 2 cups of tea per day. Moderately safe, 200 to 300 milligrams, 2 to 3 cups of coffee or 4 to 6 cups of tea. Undesirable, more than 500 milligrams. 5 cups of tea or more than 10 cups of more than 5 cups of coffee or more than 10 cups of tea. Now, you might say one seldom goes to this level, but then at least 200 to 300, and if one takes more than one helping of these drinks, can go in this range, is something which is not impossible because such drinks are now available. And that's why I'm bringing this up, and that is not really safe. And of course, toxic quantities which could even kill are more than 1,000 milligrams a day, which is extremely rare for anybody to reach. Now, why I talked about 200 to 300 milligrams and 500 milligrams is because now there are so-called energy drinks available, which have in one helping of about 300 ml, 21 teaspoons of sugar. Of course, the sugar would give energy, but then if the person is otherwise on a normal diet, it would also make the person put on weight. And why this is important is because many youngsters are taking it because, as we saw, caffeine in high doses can improve physical performance even if it has not been impaired by fatigue or lack of sleep. And therefore, particularly an athlete who is participating in a competitive event might try to depend upon this effect of caffeine, and then in addition get also additional fuel in the form of this large amount of sugar. To about 20 spoons of sugar would mean about 100 grams of sugar, and 100 grams of sugar would mean about 400 calories. So 400 calories from the sugar, and then on top of that, uh, about 300 milligrams of caffeine, which might improve the physical performance, even if it is not impaired, is something which can help that person. But then, for that very reason, this person may also get disqualified from participation. But then some youngsters just take it for a kick. They, and the, uh, it's being called an energy drink can be misguiding. And therefore, it's important to sort of keep in mind that these energy drinks can be not entirely safe, and maybe one of the reasons why the person puts on weight. And these are some research studies which have been quoted in a website uh, put up by in the put up by the Welsh state, Wales, in the United Kingdom. And why it has been put up is because the government of Wales, that state, is seriously considering banning not only energy drinks but also the sale of tea and coffee to youngsters below 16 years of age. And because too many cups of tea or coffee, or one or two helpings of these energy drinks, can have serious side effects. And some studies have shown, which they have quoted in this link, uh, show that children who drink at least one energy drink per week are more likely to report symptoms such as headaches, sleep and stomach problems, as well as low mood and irritability. And there's also evidence to link regular energy drink consumption with low educational engagement, which would naturally mean also low academic performance. So if a youngster comes or his parents say that this child's academic performance is falling and he has mood swings, is generally depressed, irritable, he seems to be anxious and jittery, and so on and so forth. The child has behavioral issues as well as academic performance is falling. Instead, in addition to thinking of purely psychological reasons in the environment, etc., environment of the child, one should also seriously try to find out whether it has been induced by regular consumption of energy drinks. So an energy drink is not really recreation. Tea and coffee are normally considered recreational drinks. An energy drink is not recreation. An energy drink is medication. And anxiety disorders precipitated by this type of medication now find a proper place in the DSM, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is used for making diagnosis and for fitting a particular person into a particular label by psychiatrists and psychologists. In that, the latest version, probably DSM-5, there is a proper disorder described as medication-induced anxiety disorder, and these energy drinks are one of those medications which can induce this disorder. Now let's see how caffeine interacts with some of the other things which are commonly consumed. Caffeine plus painkillers like paracetamol. If they're taken together, the painkillers become more effective. So one should avoid both caffeine as well as painkillers. But the fact is that most of us do use painkillers sometimes and also drink tea and coffee. And therefore, if you take your tablet of paracetamol with a cup of tea, its pain relieving effect is likely to be better. So this is a good sort of a tip for how one can improve the efficacy of the painkiller. Take it with a cup of tea, but then both tea and the painkiller might induce acidity, and therefore also take something to eat along with it. Don't take it empty stomach, but all the same, along with some food, if you take not only the painkiller, take the painkiller not with water, but with a cup of tea, it is likely to be more effective. How about the interaction between caffeine and tobacco? Say tobacco from smoking from cigarettes. The tolerance to caffeine increases, which means that now the caffeine becomes less effective as a result of uh, smoking. And therefore, the chances are that the person will take more cups of tea and coffee than he otherwise would if he also smokes. Within a short interval, the interval between smoking a cigarette and the cup of tea or coffee is not much, the person is likely to feel the effect of caffeine less and therefore likely to consume more tea and coffee. How about the interaction between caffeine and alcohol? Uh, Once again, there is a tolerance. So caffeine stimulates less than otherwise if taken along with alcohol. And therefore, again, there might be a tendency to take more of caffeine also. And on the other hand, caffeine might mask the depressant effect of alcohol, and thereby the person may take also more alcohol. Now, I might say that how is alcohol a depressant? Caffeine is a stimulant, alcohol is a depressant. And therefore, the stimulant effect of caffeine on the nervous system might mask the depressant effect of alcohol. Now, how is alcohol a depressant? Alcohol is actually a depressant, and the apparent stimulation which alcohol gives, the person becomes uh, less inhibited, more talkative, and sometimes may behave uh, irrationally and badly. A person who is normally very well behaved might start behaving badly as under the effect of alcohol. All that is not because of stimulation; it is because of the depression of the highest part of the brain, which normally inhibit or prevent us from acting in an uncivilized manner. So, removal of that inhibition because of the depression of those parts of the brain, the highest parts of the brain, the cerebral cortex, because of the depression that the person starts behaving like that. So, actually, alcohol is not a stimulant, it's a removal of the usual inhibition of uncivilized behavior because of depression that a person under that drink behaves like that. We'll talk in greater detail about alcohol in one of the subsequent sessions. But today, this much is enough that alcohol is a depressant, caffeine is a stimulant, and therefore, the stimulating effect of caffeine might mask the depressant effect of alcohol, and thereby the person might drink more alcohol than is desirable and have alcohol toxicity. So it becomes a double disaster. On one hand, the person takes more tea and coffee because it stimulates him less than otherwise, and higher the caffeine he takes, more it masks the depressant effect of alcohol, the more the alcohol he takes. So he has a tendency to take more of both as because of this interaction. So it's a double disaster. And therefore, it's strongly advised not to take caffeine and alcohol within short periods of time. They should be widely spaced in terms of time. So the first interaction is a helpful interaction, the interaction between caffeine and painkillers. The second one, not so helpful, but not so harmful either. I mean, at least it will not lead to any serious problems, but the interaction between caffeine and alcohol can lead to serious problems. So it's a strict no-no. Now, how about the protective effects of these substances, which are now being talked about quite commonly? There are plenty of research studies available on tea or coffee or chocolate preventing cancer or heart disease or diabetes. And these protective effects are attributed not to caffeine, but to the antioxidants present in tea and coffee or chocolate. And these studies are also, you also find studies on nuts, which also show the same thing. Nuts also help in preventing heart disease, diabetes, cancer, and so on. Now, what do these studies mean? These studies are usually sponsored studies. So tea industry will sponsor, some manufacturer of tea will sponsor a study on tea. Those who manufacture coffee will sponsor a study on coffee, and so on. And then what they find, they use it for advertising the product. Now, while these studies are true, these substances do, in those studies, the data that those studies have is probably true, and they do prevent cancer or heart disease or diabetes because of the antioxidants which these substances, whether it's tea, coffee, chocolate, or nuts, have. But what these advertisements tell us is only part of the truth. The part that they tell us is true that yes, these substances help in preventing these diseases. What they don't tell is that these are not the only substances which are the source of antioxidants. So the person who is advertising a study on tea makes you feel as if antioxidants are present only in tea. That is our only source of getting antioxidants, but that is not true. Antioxidants are uh, widespread, found in almost every plant food, and therefore the solution is to take plenty of plant foods, not necessarily to take tea or coffee. We are not dependent upon any of these single foods for getting our supply of antioxidants. So the sources of antioxidants in the diets are all the foods which come from plant sources, nuts, whole grains, vegetables and fruits, and don't forget the spices, which are a very concentrated source of antioxidants. And spices are also important today because we are talking about tea and coffee, and soon we'll be talking about herbal tea, which is made from these spices. So if one wants to give up tea or coffee, one should not feel that I'll be missing out these protective effects of tea and coffee. There's plenty of protection available from the rest of the plant foods. Now, this may be a good time to take a little break for any questions that you might have, because it's a pretty long session and already gone on for about half an hour. It's a midway break. Any questions at this point?
So we have a question in the chat box from Nitika Mehra. Are there certain foods that are caffeine rich other than tea or coffee?
Not caffeine rich, but many other foods also have small quantities of caffeine. Some beans, some grains, some other uh, herbs, they do have small quantities of caffeine, but these are the major ones which have substantial quantities. And it may not be caffeine, it could be some related substances also, which have similar effects like theophylline, theobromine. So whole group of compounds, so-called xanthines as we call them. So xanthines are found in many other plants also. But these are the ones which are commonly consumed and in which we find relatively larger concentration of caffeine. Tea, coffee, and chocolate or cocoa.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Hari Om, sir. One question. Hello.
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, myself. I want to ask, can I?
Yes, please.
Yes. Thank you. I wanted to ask that sometimes I have heard that instead of boiling tea in milk, yeah, means we prepare the mixture of water and milk, and we will boil the tea. So that is said to be dangerous than boiling the tea separately. So let me know, black tea is good for health or adding milk that makes some difference?
Well, there are basically two questions: whether one should add milk to tea, and secondly, what should be the sequence in which we add.
Yes.
So whether we should add milk, yes, ordinary tea, yes, we should probably add some milk because it provides a buffering, action. It improves the buffering capacity of whatever you take with tea. And that can be important, particularly for those who get acidity with tea. Milk can buffer that action. About the sequence, well, uh, the standard way is to add milk at a little later stage, and this might uh, have a rationale because there could be some interaction between some of the things present in milk and those present in tea. Particularly if some protein is present in tea, then the fat in the milk would interact with it, because protein and fat can have interactions with each other. And so it may be some of these interactions which can get prevented if you add milk at a little later stage.
Yes, actually, we should avoid tea, but some of my family members, which are senior, they don't eat anything and they just go for tea or coffee as an energy source. Thank you so much for them. I asked. Um, It was very nice session. Thank you so much. Thanks a lot.
Tea and coffee by themselves do not provide any energy. The energy comes from the milk and the sugar that we add.
Yes, sir, but I can't tell them like this. It's being habitual to them now. Okay, thanks.
Namaskar. Hello.
Yes, namaskar,
Yes, sir,
Rishikesh ji.
please go ahead.
The sugar part, I wanted to ask, is it not preferable to avoid the use of sugar in tea or coffee?
Well, that is something which is general, avoiding sugar, uh, because uh, it's carbohydrate. The more we take it in the form of a complex carbohydrate, that is starch, the better. And within starch, the more we take it in the form of whole grains, the better. So one should avoid sugar, but a certain amount of sugar intake uh, is acceptable and not too harmful. So within that quota, if a person wants to add some tea or sugar, some sugar to tea or coffee, that may be okay. So as we have discussed in those sessions on nutrition in detail, what really matters is the glycemic index of the meal as a whole. And that would depend upon what else is accompanying that sugar. And secondly, what is the total quantity of the food that is being eaten. So that is what will make a difference. And that is one way also in which adding milk to the tea, even if we don't take anything else to eat with it, that milk itself will also bring down the glycemic index, which might otherwise be there because of the sugar only. So if it is tea sweetened with sugar without milk, that is likely to have a higher glycemic index than tea which has milk.
Oh, well. Okay. Thank you.
So we have a question in the chat box.
Yes.
Tea taken on an empty stomach versus tea with biscuits. Are they equally harmful? Kindly clarify.
Taking biscuits would help, particularly a person who gets acidity with tea. So black tea for such a person will be the worst. Tea with milk will be better. And if tea and milk are along with the tea which has milk, the person also takes some biscuits, then the acidity is likely to be still less. Because the acid will have something to act upon in the stomach. That is what is important. Then it will not produce the type of irritation uh, which leads to the gastritis. That will not happen if there's something available for the acid to act upon. It can act upon the proteins in the milk, it can act upon the proteins in the biscuits.
Okay, sir.
So make the acid busy. That's what we call the buffering capacity, buffer.
Sir, will you be still taking questions or you would
If
go
there are
on to
any,
the
one
next
can take
question?
one
We
or two
still,
questions.
okay. Another question, we have spoken mostly about the physical aspects related to the talk today. What about the subtle effects on mind?
Yes, to some extent, we'll talk about those towards the end.
Okay. Is it okay to have tea after parathas? Another question in the chat box.
Yes, strictly speaking, there's no problem, physical problem. Parathas will also buffer the tea, effect of the tea. It'll also help if the paratha has quite a bit of fat, it will help us wash down the fat. One doesn't like to leave fat. It can irritate the throat. If one takes a hot drink after that, it can wash it down. And as a hot drink, tea would be in this situation better than milk, because strictly speaking, in terms of Ayurveda, any food which contains salt is incompatible with milk. And parathas have salt, and therefore paratha and milk would be viruddha ahar, incompatible combination. Whereas paratha and tea would not be incompatible.
Okay, so no more questions in the box, chat box right now.
That's all for the moment.
Yes.
So here we are. It's a continuation of this last question. Why do we take tea or coffee? Some of the common reasons are to wash down a greasy food, be it a paratha or be it a samosa or a pakoda, and to stay well in winters, because we have this feeling that we need a hot drink uh, that helps us stay well. And to some extent, of course, there are those antioxidants in tea and coffee which can help us improve our immunity. So that we, apart from just feeling warm, it might also help in other ways. But then more than this, the other reasons why we take tea or coffee is to conform. We don't want to appear very different from others. Everybody takes tea and coffee, so I'll be the odd one out if I give up tea, and then I'll not be able to socialize. So tea is also for socializing, because it's not just because of its effects that we have been talking about so far, but it's also, when we sit down and eat together, we feel more intimate with each other, and therefore offer it to guests and all the businesses where the customers are important, and the client and the person who's running the business and the client needs a good interpersonal relationship, uh, be it an insurance company, be it an investment agency, or be it a printing press, or be it a property dealer, whatever. There are so many businesses where one of the first things that the person does is, as soon as a customer comes, to offer a cup of tea. So it's a sort of used for normal socializing. It's used in business to establish a relationship, establish a rapport. And then, of course, because of the effects that we have seen, tea and coffee are used also to get quick and easy relief from fatigue, boredom, and stress. And this can be important. It's not, one can't belittle this, because if a student uh, is going for an exam and is feeling tired, has not slept too well, then even that temporary relief is useful, because then the next 3 hours during which he's sitting in the examination hall, at least he is likely to have a better performance. But then what is important is that everything works only in moderation. If the student has stayed awake almost the whole night, and during the night also he has consumed 2 or 3 cups of tea or coffee, then if he takes another cup of tea or coffee in the morning, this will not improve the performance. This might actually make him only more anxious and jittery, and start getting some palpitation, which actually will impair the performance. So everything in moderation can work, but beyond that, actually it can become counterproductive.
Actually, green tea is the best option, or we can in Marathi we call gauti chaha. I don't know the English name of that. That is very good to feel fresh and to be energized.
Well, I mean, as we saw, green tea also has caffeine, and that will have similar effects, a little less than an average cup of tea, but it does have caffeine. And apart from that, there may be other things. And then this is again psychological. If the person believes that green tea will be good for me much better than ordinary tea, then green tea will be better, because all psychological effects are partly a placebo effect. If the person thinks something will happen, it tends to happen.
Yes, sir.
So now we come to alternatives to tea and coffee. Tea and coffee may not be foods, but have an important function in life, as we saw, both sort of concrete functions as well as functions like socializing, etc. And also the fact is that most of us get away with moderate quantities of tea and coffee, taking it for decades, and apparently we don't pay a price, at least not a heavy price for it. That is one side. But on the other side, whatever harm it can do, why take that risk? Why not have an alternative? So are there any alternatives? In fact, there are plenty. There are plenty of alternatives, both hot and cold. Uh, we might need hot drinks in winters and cold drinks in summers, and we have both types available. Decaffeinated tea and coffee, soups, herbal tea, milk which has kesar, saffron, elaichi, cardamom, or badam, almonds, or turmeric, which is these days called golden milk, and malt. Malt, is made from germinated jowar, bajra, and ragi, which are ground up and then mixed with milk and jaggery and served hot. Then cold drinks, lemonade, nimbu pani, coconut water, fruit and flower drinks, wide variety of drinks, quashes, etc., made from variety of fruits and flowers. Ginger ale, jaljeera, different sherbets, rose water sharbat, khaskhas sharbat, and so on. Mango panna among the fruit products, lassi, buttermilk. So a variety of cold drinks also, which are relatively healthier alternatives to tea, coffee, and cola drinks. You might have seen that in this, I have not mentioned green tea, in fact, because green tea is not really a caffeine-free substitute. But I mentioned decaffeinated tea and coffee because they can be a substitute. So what is the caffeine content of decaffeinated tea and coffee? Negligible, just around 2 milligrams per cup. And on the other hand, what is the caffeine content of green tea? As we saw, around 30 milligrams per cup. By comparison, a cup of ordinary tea has about 50 milligrams and a cup of coffee is 100 milligrams. So it's less, but all the same, what you get from 1 cup of coffee, you can get from 2 cups of tea and from 3 cups of green tea. That much is the difference. Now, coming to herbal tea, we'll focus on herbal tea for some time, how to make it. And the right way to make herbal tea is to heat the water till it comes to boil and then place the cut leaves, say it is tulsi leaves or any other type of mint leaves or whatever leaves you are using, cut them into small pieces to increase the surface area that will be exposed. Cut them, place them at the bottom of the cup, or if you're using powdered spices, place a pinch of the powdered spices at the bottom of the cup. And then add boiling water to the cup, and then cover the cup with a lid. Remove the lid after 1 or 2 minutes. In these 1 or 2 minutes, the aroma will settle down. Herbal tea is ready. The tea may be inhaled if you like, and then you can drink the tea up when it is comfortably warm. Let it cool down till it is at the right temperature. So the key points are that the spices have been placed already in the cup at the bottom of the cup, and then to that we add boiling water. We don't boil the spices with the water for a long time. That will become a kadha. That will not really be herbal tea. Now, how can herbal tea be sweetened? Firstly, avoid sweetening it for the sake of sweetness, because it doesn't really have to be sweet. This reminds me of a beautiful quotation by the mother, which says, "Take pleasure in everything that you do, but do nothing for the sake of pleasure alone." So you don't have to sweeten the tea for the sake of sweetness alone. Sweetness is a sensory pleasure which a person on the spiritual path should not really be caring about so much. And so if he has opted for herbal tea because a healthier drink, he can keep away from the craving for sweetening it. And in fact, it is basically a conditioning. We feel that something which is sweet is more palatable than something which is not sweet. But whether it is herbal tea or whether it is ordinary tea, those who start taking it without sugar initially may miss the sugar. But then after a few months, in fact, they start liking it, and they do not like it if sugar has been added to it. In fact, they insist that please don't add sugar to my tea. I don't like it. So avoid sweetening it just for the sake of sweetness. Secondly, some spices have a natural, subtle, and mild sweetening effect. Among these are cinnamon or dalchini, cardamom, elaichi, clove, long, which are commonly used in herbal tea. Particularly sweet is yashti madhu, also called mulethi, and English called licorice. But too much of mulethi may be harmful, so try to keep it to a maximum of 1 gram per day or so, certainly less than 5 grams. When sweetened, can herbal tea be sweetened with honey? Yes, it can be, but not when the tea is very hot, because honey should not only be not boiled, honey should not be added to a drink which is very hot. So honey should be added only when the tea has cooled down to the temperature that is comfortable for drinking, because honey dissolves in water very easily. So even if you allowed the tea to cool down to a temperature at which you're actually going to drink it, that is the stage at which honey can be added. A spoon of tea to a cup of herbal tea. Sorry, a spoon of honey to a cup of herbal tea. Honey, in fact, could be not only just a sweetening agent, it might increase the potency of some herbs. And honey is particularly good for people who have a kapha dominant prakriti. At the same time, honey should be avoided by those who have a pitta dominant prakriti. Can one add milk to herbal tea? As a rule, no, because there can be interactions between the herbs and the milk. Particularly, milk and tulsi or basil, botanical name is Ocimum sanctum, are incompatible foods. However, there is an exception. If the tea does not contain this incompatible food, that is tulsi, and the tea has been made for a child who finds the spices too strong, a small quantity of milk may be added to the herbal tea. Now, which are the herbs one should use in herbal tea? Now, herbal tea, in fact, in a way is a rather inappropriate expression because tea itself is also a herb. So when we just say a cup of tea, that itself is also herbal. On the other hand, herbal tea may have no tea at all in it. You can have other herbs, but no tea, no herb called tea, and yet you call it herbal tea. So perhaps a proper herbal tea, which doesn't have any tea in it, should be just called a herbal hot drink rather than herbal tea. Now, which are the spices which are acceptable round the year? Because the use of spices should be to some extent guided by the weather or the season rather, not weather, season. Now, those which are acceptable round the year are plenty. Dry ginger, that is adrak powder or sunthi, turmeric, haldi, cardamom or small or choti ilaichi, clove or long pepper, pipali, mint or pudina, lemongrass. So many of them. But one doesn't have to add all of them to a cup of herbal tea. You can select a few, whichever you fancy more. Some of them are sweet fragrance, some of them are slightly sweet. So you can choose whatever you like, but 2 or 3 should be enough. One doesn't have to add all of them. And you can also have a variety. On different days, you could use different spices, but one doesn't have to add all of them at the same sitting in the same cup of tea. But these are all spices which are acceptable around the year. Spices which should be particularly avoided in summers are black pepper, kali mirch, wet ginger or adrak. Dry ginger powder is okay around the year, but not wet ginger. And omam or ajwain, ocimum or basil, tulsi, cinnamon, dalchini, and saffron or kesar. Now these should be avoided in summers. Those which should be avoided in rains are aniseed or fennel or saunf, saffron or kesar. Those to be avoided in winters are again aniseed or saunf, also called fennel, coriander or dhania, and rose or gulab. And those which should be avoided in Sharad, 15th September to 15th November, what is sometimes called autumn or fall. Those which should be avoided during this period are again wet ginger or adrak, ajwain or omam, cardamom, the big one, badi ilaichi, black pepper or kali mirch, ocimum or basil, tulsi, cinnamon, dalchini, saffron, kesar. In fact, this period of the year, 15th September to 15th November, is not a very healthy period. And that's why perhaps it's important to keep in mind that many of these spices, which otherwise may be okay, are not okay in this period of the year. But then there are plenty which are okay around the year and one can use those. Now, how about yoga and caffeine? One might feel that anything which contains caffeine or such things should be absolutely incompatible with spirituality. Spirituality means overcoming all types of sensory pleasures. But then it's an interesting fact that I came across while trying to study this topic. It's there in the essay on caffeine in Wikipedia, that the earliest credible evidence of either coffee drinking or knowledge of some coffee plants appears in the middle of the 15th century in the Sufi monasteries of the Yemen in southern Arabia. Now, if the Sufis can have their realization in spite of coffee, apparently coffee by itself does not prevent the person from making considerable progress on the spiritual path. Now, once again, let's return to the reasons for which we take tea or coffee, apart from improving the performance when it has been impaired by lack of sleep, etc. Firstly, I mean, a person with a healthy lifestyle should not have that type of lack of sleep and should have normal, steady energy levels. And for that purpose, the person should not take tea or coffee. But even for these reasons probably would not apply to a person on the spiritual path. He doesn't have to conform, because in any case, he's the odd one out. The person on the spiritual path is always the odd one out. He doesn't have to socialize with everybody. His relationships are generally limited to people who are like-minded. And to get quick and easy relief from fatigue, boredom, and stress is something which should not apply to him, because he should not have these. If he's advising everybody else how to keep these things away, if he can't treat his own fatigue and stress or boredom, then how can he advise others? So many of the reasons do not apply, and therefore it should not be necessary for this person to take tea or coffee. And so far as this sensory indulgence is concerned, that in any case should not apply to him, because he has overcome that attachment to sensory pleasures. But all the same doesn't mean that he should not take it at all. He can take it without being attached. And one of the ways to test it would be not to take it very regularly. Take it when it is available, take it when it is necessary, but don't miss it when you don't take it. And to that, you have to actually test by not taking it. Otherwise, the person may remain under the illusion that I'm not attached to it, but the person might have actually become dependent on it. And if the person has become dependent and wants to overcome that dependence, one just has to use a little willpower and persist for 3 or 4 days. And as we saw, the dependence on tea or coffee can be overcome in 3 or 4 days. In a way, there's a two-way interaction between caffeine and yoga. Caffeine gives us those mood swings, feeling high because of the energy levels. And then when the energy levels start going down, feeling down. So fluctuations in energy levels and the consequent fluctuations in mood. Now, because of these things which happen due to caffeine, it may be more difficult to maintain the yogic equanimity. So that's how caffeine affects the yogic poise. On the other hand, the practice of yoga also affects the effects of caffeine, because the person practicing yoga in the true manner, not just the physical practices, but also bringing the yogic attitude to life, this person becomes more sensitive to the effects of caffeine. Smaller doses start raising his heart rate and blood pressure and start giving him palpitation. So he becomes more sensitive, which means that even if he uses tea or coffee, he should use it in a much smaller quantity than generally done, because his body has become more sensitive to it. We can end with at least one tea which nobody is against, and that is positivity. Quite a bit of what we talked today, you'll find in this book, Back to Health Through Yoga, spread over these pages from 65 to 70. The book is available both in print as well as an ebook online on Amazon. And the book is also available in the bookshop of Sri Aurobindo Ashram Delhi branch, from where I'm speaking. Yes Talks and Yes Courses are a part of the celebrations of the 150th birth anniversary of Sri Aurobindo and the 75th anniversary of India's independence. These three, yoga, education, and spirituality, are interrelated subjects. Yoga itself is education, and any education is incomplete without spirituality. And spirituality, when put into practice, practiced in daily life, is what yoga is. We're happy to get your comments and questions on yes@yesspirituality.com. Gratitude to the Mother and Sri Aurobindo for making these sessions possible. And thank you all for being there.
Thank you so much, sir. Thanks a lot. We already have one question. We got it during the session in the chat box. What about the prescription that some yoga teachers do about not taking coffee because it is an obstacle for meditation. Is that a myth? Depends on the individual, or there is some truth in it? Could you please explain further?
It depends upon the individual. So these things can't have hard and fast rules. Firstly, um, as we saw, the disturbance in the poise that tea and coffee bring about is related quite a bit about what the person has been doing before that. Has he been overworked? Has he missed sleep? Or whether he has been taking just because of being dependent on tea and coffee, or because of socializing, taking tea and coffee rather too frequently. So both these things will have different types of effects on the person, and that will then affect this quality of the meditation that this person might have. So we can't really generalize, and uh, these rules which are sometimes given are given to simplify things. But then simplification also means that uh, it becomes more of a ritual or an injunction rather than something which is strictly necessary or helpful.
Thank you, sir. Participants, if anyone has a question, please put up in the chat box, or you can raise the hand. And
one question, sir, small one. We these days usually we drink the hot tea or the hot coffee, and these days a lot of youngsters are into taking cold coffee or cold tea. So is there a difference?
Probably not much, because uh, from a strictly sort of scientific point of view, in terms of modern science, what one would say is that yes, uh, if it is cold, it will take some time for it to warm up in the stomach. Uh, so it may take longer to be processed in the gastrointestinal tract, maybe slower to absorb, because all reactions slow down at lower temperatures. But then eventually it will come to the body temperature once it is in the stomach. And uh, the way it should be processed, it will be processed. It spends enough time there for all that to happen. So from the strictly scientific point of view, it should not matter. And that's why a cola drink uh, makes us alert to the same extent as a cup of tea or coffee. It can also do it, although the cola drinks are always consumed cold. But from the Ayurvedic point of view, there might be some subtle differences, which I won't be very sure about. And in general, in Ayurveda, they don't actually encourage cold drinks. Even a cold drink should not be taken too cold.
Durjoy, sir, you have raised the hand. Yeah, please go ahead, please.
Yeah, thank you very much for a very clear, concise, apparently simple but complex problem. And I was going to ask some questions in between, but then towards the end, you handled, all of those things like, the social implications, which are, there, which are quite difficult for the average person to deal with. And, coffee and tea, they have been linked for generations, ages, with cultures. So it's a very complex thing, but thank you for, bringing up all those issues. And then towards the end for mentioning that ultimately, like anything, everything in life, it's a matter of choice. It's a matter of making wise choices. So perhaps we will not be able to completely do away with tea or coffee. We could manage with alternatives, or maybe just having in moderation, some of it. So is that correct? That
Yes, exactly.
we
I mean,
can-
either moderation or alternatives, or both. Sometimes tea itself, sometimes an alternative. The two are not mutually exclusive. Tea in moderation and also alternatives.
Thank you.
We have a question in the chat box. Drinking cold coffee at late night, does it affect hormonal balance? I don't know if it's a question or comment. I'm not sure if, sir, you would like to comment on.
Well, late night, one should not be having anything at all. In terms of a healthy lifestyle, a healthy daily routine, Late at night, one should be asleep, not taking anything, be it tea or coffee or if food. And that's why I mentioned particularly that a student might benefit a little from a cola drink or a tea or coffee just before going for the exam, but only if the person has slept fairly well and the previous cup of tea or coffee was not taken uh, a little before that, another cup just before going to the examination hall. Otherwise, the effects would compound and the person is more likely to get anxiety and become more jittery, may have mental confusion, and the performance might actually get impaired. He'll not be sleepy, but at the same time, the mental performance will not improve. It will improve only if he had reasonably good sleep and the last cup of tea probably he had was before he went to bed, not and didn't go to bed too late. So then only this early morning tea or coffee before going to the examination might help.
Thank you so much, sir, for a very interesting and helpful session for all of us. I thank the participants for being with us. We can close today's session with a moment of peaceful silence. Namaste.